Chapter 3, Alabama, 1979. It was fall when I moved to Alabama, and the leaves were changing colors. I was escorted down south by Cousin Red, who lived in Alabama. He told me stories about how beautiful the state was and that the air was fresher. People seasoned their food better and were hospitable. I didn't believe him because he was a talker. We drove in my granddaddy's 1978 Regal Buick through many hills and next to high mountains. The ride was very long. As we got closer to the southern states, I started looking for the red dirt that he talked about. But I kept quiet because I felt confused about the change that was about to take place. We finally crossed the Alabama state line as we drove through Birmingham. I thought, hey, this doesn't look bad. But we kept going through smaller and smaller towns, and we still hadn't made it to our destination. Eventually, we turned onto Highway 219 South, which led us to Selma. I thought we were never going to stop driving. We turned off Highway 219 onto another road that led us to the red dirt. At the top of a long, steep hill, I saw plenty of red dirt that sat high off the bank of the road. There were trees everywhere, and the houses were far apart. All of a sudden, the car stopped, and Red said, "Naima, you're home." I panicked. "What did you say?" "This is your grandparents' home," he said. "We're here." "Are you for real?" I asked. Then he blew the horn. Uncle Amos and my grandparents came out to greet us, along with a bunch of dogs and cats. I looked around. There were no houses next door, no paved roads or sidewalks. There were lots of trees, plenty of skies, and peaceful nature all around. Animal noises echoed in the air for miles. I couldn't express in words what I was feeling at this particular moment, but I was terrified. There were no kids in sight. I wanted to die. I couldn't believe that this was happening to me, and I had to live there until I turned 18. It only got worse. I soon found out that my grandparents' Alabama house was an old 3-room with no bathroom. My granddaddy's daddy had built it in the late 1800s, so we had to use a pot called a slop jar for our toilet, the fireplace for our heat, and a wood stove for cooking. I felt like I was living in a little house on the prairie. We even had a well in the back of the house. This was our primary water source. I started asking questions about why did we move here and why I had to leave my school. My new life down south was like opening up a novel on slavery during the late 1860s. I'd seen Roots, and that gave me a pretty good idea of how hard life had been and still was for African Americans. Our way of living was not modern for the early 80s. I felt that this affected me emotionally as well as mentally. School was in session, but my grandparents moved in slow motion when it came down to handling affairs outside the home. On top of other things, we needed to get our living situation together. I was living with my grandparents and Uncle Amos in this little house. There was no privacy, and I had to do hard chores daily. I learned how to feed the animals, chop wood to make fires, and lock the animals up at night. I didn't know how to accomplish what I needed to do successfully. My grandmother didn't have a lot of patience in training me because I didn't seem content with my new life on Wakefield Hill. She fussed at me all the time. This whole experience felt like a nightmare at boot camp. My grandmother told me that I had no other choice but to go back north to live with my mother. She stressed how bad my life would be if I did that. That brought tears to my eyes. I had never imagined living like this with no place else to go. Finally, my granddaddy enrolled me in school, and I started attending Suttles Junior High. My homeroom teacher's name was Mrs. Hornbuckle. To my surprise, Uncle Amos was accepted to the same school and was in my homeroom. I noticed that he could communicate very well with the kids in my classes. They seemed to be fond of him and did a lot of kidding around. I, however, felt ashamed of him because he wasn't normal looking and couldn't speak clearly. I was afraid that the kids would not like me because of his handicap, but that turned out to be untrue. One day in our homeroom class, before the bell rang, Uncle Amos told a classmate next to us about an incident that had happened the night before. I gave him a mean look to be quiet, and of course he wouldn't listen. He told Mary Lynn that I had stolen his weenie off his plate. She laughed and wanted to know the whole story in detail. At that point, I stopped trying to hide the fact that we were related. I told her that he was my uncle. Mary Lynn explained how all the girls loved him to chase them around the school during recess. He made them laugh because he was a clown with a big heart. He would never hurt anyone, but he didn't take any mess from the kids at school. He would warn you to quit messing with him. Some kids did tease him to provoke him, but if he came home complaining to my grandmother, she would not have hesitated to handle it. The teachers respected him because my grandfather was a bishop. He was well known and respected by the majority of the people he came across. He had a beautiful spirit, and when he spoke, his voice drew attention. My third period teacher, Mrs. James, called my name in class one day, and I responded, "What?" She went off on me. "You are not up north, young lady. I don't know what they've been teaching you, but you better say yes, ma'am, and no, sir, to your elders down here." My feelings were hurt, and I felt embarrassed, but I began to catch on after that episode. My grandparents had never informed me of the different values and beliefs expected of me in the South, so I paid attention to how the other kids responded. My gym teacher, Mrs. Heiberger, suggested that I try out for track. I joined the track team, but I didn't have any transportation. My grandmother didn't drive, and my grandfather was always away from home traveling. Nor did I have track teammates that lived close. Things finally worked out for me to catch a ride from a staff worker at school related to one of my cousins. Whenever I got the approval to go places, Uncle Amos wanted to follow. Eventually, he joined the special ed track team, which turned out to be cool because he was popular and won the majority of his races. When we practiced at home, he would run like a chicken with his head cut off, but I'd always win. Once I got involved in track, things didn't seem so bad. I was learning how to be content. I met some kids that lived up the road, the Smiths and the Johnsons. My bus driver was Mrs. Johnson. She was my cousin Red's mother. I did not realize it, but most people there were related to each other in some way or another. Once track season ended, though it got very boring, and I wrote my father a letter explaining that I disliked it down south. I asked him if he would come down to make things better for me. I explained about the transportation, how hard it was to go to town, and how I wanted to participate in some activities after school. Eventually, he did come down to live with us. My father's way of keeping conversation was to talk about his life stories. I think he appreciated life to some degree because God had spared him and given him another chance. He also lived with us in this 3-room house. We had a kitchen, a living room, and 1 bedroom. My grandparents had made the living room into a bedroom too, so I slept in the same room with my grandparents in my own big bed. The beds were made out of cast iron, and the mattresses were firm and solid. One night, my daddy took Uncle Amos and me for a ride to the store. We always wanted to go for a ride and get some junk food. The trip to the store was very long and dark. On our way back from the store, Daddy turned down a different road and pulled over, saying he had to check something out on the truck. He asked me to come to the back of the truck, but I said it was dark and I was afraid. He insisted that I come to see what he wanted. So I got out and walked around to the back where he was standing. He pulled out his privacy. I became frightened and ran back to get inside the truck, and then I demanded that Uncle Amos sit in the middle between Daddy and me. When we got back home, I didn't say anything about this to my grandparents because I didn't feel close to my grandmother. I saw they depended on my father for errands and chores around the place. I didn't know how to break the news. On another occasion, my father asked me to come to his bedroom to look at some magazines. I didn't want to, but since he insisted, I went to see the magazines, which were X-rated. After I realized that, I started walking away from him, but he threw me on the bed and forced his lips to mine. He tried to put his tongue into my mouth, but I struggled up and told him no. Then I ran to the kitchen where my grandmother was. I don't know if she could see the expression on my face, but I was confused and in a state of disbelief. This episode caused me to withdraw and put some distance between my father and me because he was becoming very obsessive. He made me wash his feet one night and told me to read the Bible to him. I had read the scripture about how disobedient children would not live out their days. Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God has commanded you, that your days may be long and that it may be well with you in the land which the Lord your God is giving you. Deuteronomy chapter 5, verses 16. I was too afraid to tell on my father for fear of the outcome. I started clinging more to my grandfather to protect me. I think my grandparents saw that my contact with him had changed. They never questioned my behavior, but I think they knew something wasn't right in my heart. On Friday nights, my father would go around the curve to Benny Mae's house and drink liquor. Some folks said she was mixing it with rubbing alcohol. When he got home, he would wake everybody up, talking loudly, saying stupid stuff, and ready to fight anybody that got in his way. He carried a rifle and had a very unruly temper when he got drunk. It eventually caused my grandfather to ask him to leave. My father got very upset, but my grandfather took a stand. Once my father moved out, things were a lot better. He built a house across the way on the family land. His drinking persisted, and over time, it got worse. From that point on, he became a living nightmare. I would do anything to avoid seeing him. Whenever I was at school, I was always daydreaming about being free. My 8th grade graduation was coming up, and I was counting down the days and years to go. I had a cousin that I admired named Joy. She was beautiful, and we were the same age. She lived in Detroit and kept me up to date on all the latest fashions, dances, hairstyles, and slang. My grandmother asked Joy's mother, my Aunt Barbara, to send me a white dress for my graduation. Aunt Barbara dressed her kids in the finest clothes because they were privileged. The day the box came, I was so excited to see my dress. I opened it quickly, but when I touched the dress to hold it up, I became angry. The material was very thick. It was late spring in Alabama, and the temperature was in the 80s on most days. I knew that I would look stupid and feel uncomfortable wearing that dress, but I had no choice. I forced myself to like it by tying a silk ribbon around the waist. That brought out more style. I knew that the dress had to come from the Goodwill, but what bothered me the most was that Aunt Barbara didn't care that it was out of season. Aunt Barbara and her kids came along with more cousins and my sister to visit that summer. It was very nice to have company, but they could never get too comfortable at grandmother's house. It was very old and way too small to hold all of the family. Some of the men folks slept over at my father's house. It didn't bother me that we didn't have enough sleeping room as long as I was happy. I enjoyed my cousins down to the very last moment before saying goodbye because I was not used to being isolated. They all shared my pain. I remember crying because I wanted to go back with them. My grandfather comforted me, saying I could ride with him up north when he took his trip. Once they all left, life was boring and lonely again, especially when I was out of school for the summer. My grandfather decided to start farming, so he bought 25 acres of land. He figured that this would be how he would feed his family when they came down in the summers to visit. Before I knew it, the farming began. I was in a field, putting seeds in the ground and walking down many rows. I was angry because it was hot and sunny. I saw no end to this madness or why it was necessary. My grandmother told me that I could stay home if I wanted to, but I knew the consequences. I would have to deal with my father's harassment. I saw no way out. We had a lot of seeds to plant, so my grandfather asked the Smith family to help us because they had 8 strong children. He paid the hired help, but my wages were in the form of a pop and honey bun. Trust me, it was refreshing to have a cold soda and a honey bun after working from sun up till noon. It was something to look forward to. During the first few weeks of this, I wanted to run away. Never in my wildest dreams would I have fathomed that I would be working in a field one day. It had never occurred to me that my life would follow the journey of roots. I couldn't figure out why we had to do this hard labor. It wasn't like we ate a lot. Granddaddy's idea did make money, and it fed the family. Still, the labor time and profits never balanced out with what he invested. Once the crops were ready, we packed up everything that needed to go up north. My father was the driver, and Granddaddy conducted the funds, transportation, and food for the trip. He was a man of integrity and a well-respected human being with many visions and dreams. I listened to him faithfully because he had the anointing of God over his life. He was a praying man, and I wanted to please him by being smart so he could reward me. He was fair and wise and always had something kind to say. He never doubted you unless you showed him otherwise. We loaded the truck with watermelon, greens, okra, sweet potatoes, cucumbers, tomatoes, you name it, we had it. While up north, we sold all the produce, and I visited with my cousins I had missed dearly. We stayed for almost 2 weeks, and then we headed back south. I coordinated my new clothes and hand-me-downs. I was starting high school at East Perry High, located in the rural part of Marion, off the main highway that led to many towns like Marion, Selma, and Centerville. I wore my hair in either 2 twists or 2 French braids. I was quiet in school and very shy. I stayed low-key because I didn't want to attract any attention. Uncle Amos attended the special education classes at East Perry. We were placed into separate homerooms, but the school system moved him each year according to my grade level. As a freshman, I didn't participate in any after-school activities because my father had to approve and be a part of everything. I lost trust in him, and I realized he wasn't the nice father I thought he was. Inside my mind, I felt trapped because I saw no way out. I didn't know who to trust with all these emotions that were rolling around inside my heart. Therefore, I suppressed them as though they didn't exist. But at high school, I felt more independent because it was a bigger school. I did a lot of daydreaming during my classes, fantasizing about being in California where my favorite cousin lived. I continued to feel that my life resembled Kunta Kinte's in Roots because my mind was always fixated on leaving Alabama. I knew that I couldn't share how I felt with anyone down south. I believed that my opinion would rub off in a wrong way. I tried to understand how people were content living in the rural areas where it was boring and slow. During my lonely times at home, I would read the Bible and inspirational literature and write letters to Jesus. I would tell him all about my fears and troubles. I thanked him for the times when I didn't have to submit to my father's negativity, who was acting like the devil and being a hindrance in my life. I realized that he wasn't going anywhere else to live because he had no dreams. Since I couldn't avoid seeing him, I distanced myself emotionally and mentally. Eventually, I fell into the routine of going to school, church, doing chores, and helping our elderly cousins who lived across the road. My grandfather had cousins called Cousin Pete and Cousin Louise, who were husband and wife. Cousin Pete would often ask if I could come and sit with Cousin Louise. She had diabetes and both her legs had been amputated. She was nice and kept a clean house, and I got paid for sitting with her and got to eat snacks. Sometimes I was able to miss out on going to the field and doing chores. One evening, while I was sitting with Cousin Louise, she rode her wheelchair to the back of the house. Cousin Pete was preparing to take his nightly walk, and as he was walking past me for the door, he grabbed one of my breasts and smiled. I was terrified, jerking my body away after that incident. I tried to avoid going over there. I didn't tell my grandparents about this because I didn't want to stir up any trouble. My cousin Velvet came down to attend school. It was an adventure because she and I didn't get along. She was starting the 5th grade at Suttles Elementary, and I had to show her the ropes regarding chores and farming. We argued a lot, and sometimes she wanted to fight me when she couldn't have her way. My grandmother showed favoritism towards Velvet because she was cute and very dark-skinned. She had been teased about her skin complexion a lot while growing up, which caused her to have low self-esteem. We had a lot of fair and light-skinned cousins, and I think because Velvet had been teased about her complexion, it scarred her. She was a troublemaker and tattletale. Whenever she and I would disagree, I was punished, which caused me to dislike her. She would start the devilment, but when I called her names, she'd run and tattle about anything, as small as a word or a dirty look. I tried to get along with her because she eased the burdens off me and filled that lonely space. One evening, after tending to chores, feeding the animals, and locking up the chicken coop, we realized we had forgotten to bring a bucket of water into the house. It was nighttime, and we didn't have a drop of water in case of an emergency. We had to go outside to draw water out of the well. It was pitch dark, and we both were pulling the bucket from the bottom of the well. Velvet heard something in the bushes near the woods and let go of the rope, which caused me to lose my grip. I knew that if we allowed the bucket to hit the bottom, we would get a beating. So I struggled to hold onto it. By the time I got a good grip, it had scorched the insides of my hands. I had severe rope burns on my fingers and hands. I cried because of the pain and couldn't write in class for at least a week. My father visited from time to time. I believe he had a plan up his sleeve to wean me back into his sickness. On my 15th birthday, he bought me a cake and I received a few cards from some friends at school. We got home from school. Velvet and Uncle Amos were eager to go over to Jonathan's to eat ice cream and cake. I went along figuring I was safe in case he tried anything because Velvet was there. She and Uncle Amos could talk to him openly about anything. Although I was apprehensive about being there, I remained quiet to observe the environment. Daddy took some photos of us and asked if he could take some pictures of us in the woods. We never agreed to do anything like that, but his mind wasn't right, as you can see. Since we didn't go along with his plan, he started harassing us. He'd come to my grandparents' house when he was intoxicated, telling them that Velvet and I were out at night riding on a motorcycle and running with boys. My grandfather didn't buy this because he knew where we were at nighttime. Next, Daddy took us to town one Saturday, bought us some groceries, and gave each of us money to buy some personal things. But after we got back from town, we discovered that his stuff had gotten mixed in with ours. We walked over to his house to give him his food and to thank him again. When we got up to leave, he told me I couldn't go. He told Velvet to run home. She didn't like his answer or the expression on my face, so she ran home to tell my grandmother what was happening. My father held me hostage, threatening to shoot me if I tried to leave his house. He explained that he would kill me and that I was full of shit. He went on about blowing my brains out if I kept fucking with him. He talked about all kinds of mess, accusing me of liking my uncles and asking which boy was I letting fill on me. I endured his verbal, mental, and emotional abuse for approximately 8 hours, all the time praying to the Lord to hear my cry. I didn't believe that anyone was ever going to rescue me. Eventually, my grandmother came over and yelled out my father's name, but he wouldn't answer the front door. Then she walked around to the side door of his house, which he left open, and asked him why was he keeping me there. He told her to mind her own business. Still, she paid him no attention and told him the law would get him if he didn't let me go. She demanded that he let me leave. I immediately ran out the door all the way home. I will never forget that day. I can't recall ever going to his house willingly or alone after that episode. He had traumatized me to the point that I would get tense whenever I heard his voice or if someone said his name. When he came over to visit my grandparents, I'd go inside the house and act busy. When the fall settled in, we were able to rest from laboring in the fields. By the time spring came, Velvet was getting homesick and started complaining to her mother. Her mother drove down to pick her up, and my life went back to the same old routine. I was never content being isolated, especially when school was out. I felt that there wasn't anything worthwhile to wake up for. There was no place to go but to the field. At least on Sundays, we'd go to church and sometimes to town. The most exciting part about going to town was eating at the restaurants. We heard that the local church was giving out free lunches during the week at noontime. It was a state-funded program that lasted a month. Uncle Amos and I were able to get only a few lunches. Still, it was cool regardless because we got the chance to see some different faces besides the animals and each other. Nothing was more exciting than imagining the day when I would graduate from high school and leave Alabama. Those days were marked on a secret calendar in my heart. I remained humble through my circumstances because I had to trust God. I always believed what the scripture said about disobedient children not living out their days despite the brutality inflicted by my father. I wanted God to bless me to see a better life. When my grandmother was upset with me, she would declare that I would turn out like my mother, abused and mistreated by men, violent, unruly, homeless, boastful, and rotten to the core. I wouldn't accept her words. Instead, I fought hard to be a better person. I prayed to Jesus in silence to help me survive this life. One day, one of my aunts called my grandmother to give her disturbing news about my mother. She had murdered her newest husband, Leroy, and had been incarcerated. It was another hard tragedy to face. When I spoke to Rocky about it, his version of what happened was that our mother and Leroy were drinking and arguing. Rocky told them to separate that evening because he could tell somebody was going to get hurt. Shortly after he left, the neighbors heard gunshots coming from the house and reported it to the police. The police marched in to find Leroy lying in a pool of blood. He was pronounced dead on the scene. My mother was exonerated for the murder charges after pleading insanity. She was clinically ill and society released her without any provisions regarding her behavior. It was harvest time in Alabama, and the crops were ready to be taken up north. I pleaded to go on this trip, but my father had another plan. He tried to get me to ask my grandparents if I could live with him. He continued to plot and scheme against my innocence. While we were in Mount Clemens this time, his plan was to go to the courthouse to file for custody. He picked a fight because I would disagree. I told him that I didn't want to live with him, and as I turned away, he hit me in the head with his fist. I lost my balance and went tumbling down 42 stairs. Once I got up, I started crying and cussing at him and took off running outside. Aunt Joyce came to see what was happening and asked him, "Why did he hit me?" I have no idea what his reply was. The spirit of fear grew inside my heart as I imagined him killing me. He was tormenting me in every way he could to gain control. When my cousins visited, they could see and feel my pain. They'd say words of encouragement to help me, like, "You'll be 18 soon, and you don't have much longer." Nothing seemed to comfort me. I truly wanted to die. No one knew about the agony going on inside my mind or thoughts of suicide. My cousins finally asked my grandparents and father why I couldn't live in Michigan with them. My grandparents wanted to let me go. They knew I desired to leave, but my father harassed them about it and put fear in them. My aunt in California also wanted to take me in and send me to school, but my father wasn't having it. I already knew that he wasn't going to go for that because he wanted to ruin me. I got on my knees and prayed to Jesus, my only source of hope. I needed this Jesus that my granddaddy preached about more than ever. I believed that one day I'd be set free if I could be patient and do good. I cried for many days and nights. My spirit was broken. I was angry, and the agony was piercing my mind. All of this made my grandmother more distant around me. She could see that I was miserable. It was the end of the summer, and I was getting excited about starting school and dying to get away from Wakefield Hill. I had to bounce back and accept my situation. I started preparing for school by looking through magazines like Right On and Ebony. I wanted to go back to school looking different for my sophomore year. I wanted a fresh new look. I wore my hair down and put on lip gloss, and for the first time in my life, I got a lot of attention. I liked the attention, to tell you the truth. I had a few classes mixed with the seniors and juniors, and they'd flirt with me and tell me that they liked the new look. In my home economics class, I met a new girl from Chicago. Twyla was outgoing, pretty, petite, and smart, but very mouthy. She had that Chi-Town flair. She wore very stylish clothes, and her hair was hooked up. Twyla was a senior, and I admired how she carried herself. She didn't take any mess. Most of all, we clicked because we were from up north. We became friends just through that connection. It was common down south to start dating at the age of 15, and if you weren't, you'd be teased. I hid the fact that I enjoyed the attention of being flirted with, but was scared to let anyone know that I couldn't date or get out the house. One day in home economics, we had to form groups to start doing different projects. A boy named Saul Melton, who was a senior, joined my group. He was flirting with me and offered to buy my portion of supplies. Saul and I became friends. He started calling me little girl when he'd see me in between changing classes. That didn't bother me. He was the oldest, and that was his way of saying he liked me. Soon Saul asked if I would be his girlfriend. I told him that I couldn't have a boyfriend. Hence, he asked if I would be his girlfriend at school. I was afraid of having a boyfriend. Still, I liked the attention, so I secretly became his girlfriend with no idea how I would pull this off. Saul asked me to go with him into our algebra teacher's room. Then he pulled me close to him and put his lips to mine. It all happened quite fast in between changing classes. I immediately ran out of the room to make it to my next class before the bell rang. When he kissed me, I had my glasses on, but I remember seeing stars. I felt so dorky and ashamed. I didn't know what I had been thinking because I had never kissed a boy. Saul asked me if I would be his prom date and if I could have company. I knew that the pressure was going to start. I had dreaded this moment and found myself feeling even dumber. I told him that my grandparents are strict and that I wasn't old enough to court, but he kept asking me, trying to find ways to convince me that he could make it happen. I couldn't lie to my grandparents, and I didn't dare let my father know about us. Saul finally chilled out since he could detect my nervousness. He was popular in school and was known for talking, singing in the talent shows, and goofing off. He never seemed to care about doing his lesson and would ask different girls to write his papers and do his homework. One thing he seemed to do well was type. I was impressed because I didn't know how to type. The seniors were preparing for graduation, and that meant that Saul would be leaving East Perry. I was able to attend his graduation because some of the folks that lived on my side of town were seniors too, so my grandparents allowed me to catch a ride. Whenever I got out to attend anything after school without my family, it was like winning the lottery. I knew what my summer entailed. I can truly say that I hated my summers more than my school life in the South, despite my cousins visiting. I counted the days down to the hours to when I would graduate. I knew this meant a lot to my grandparents. They said that once I turned 18 and graduated from high school, they were done. That stayed in the back of my mind. But whenever my father heard it, he'd say something different. To him, I wasn't grown until I turned 21. I blocked that out of my mind along with anything else he had to say because I knew that he would rain on my parade. Listening to my classmates discussing summer plans to go away and visit family, I felt lonely on the inside because I didn't have anyone with whom I could confide. I had to live with my circumstances until my change came. One summer day, when we went to the field to work the crops, it got so hot that I just didn't have the will to work. My grandmother started fussing because she didn't believe in me sitting around or lounging under a shade tree. She believed in working like a slave. When I looked up, I saw my granddaddy heading towards me. He was walking very fast and slinging his arms back and forth behind his back while he whistled. To see his arms moving in haste meant that he was serious. At this point, I got scared. I knew that either I would get a whooping or he punished me in some way. My grandfather told me to get in the truck and drive. I didn't quite understand what he meant, but I immediately climbed inside the truck. Then I put it into gear and I accelerated on the gas. He told me to watch for the potholes and to stay on the road. The branches were hitting the sides of the truck because the road was so narrow. My grandfather put me behind the steering wheel to drive him all over Alabama from that day on. I was so happy. This allowed me to meet people and see different towns and cities. We'd rise early and have breakfast before we left for church on Sundays. Driving for my granddaddy relieved me of feeding the animals, drawing water out of the well, and chopping wood. By the time we got home, it would be pitch dark and bedtime. I didn't have my driver's license, but I drove carefully. We went to Marion, Selma, Mobile, Uniontown, Centerville, and other towns I'd never heard of before. We made our summer trip to Michigan, sold our produce, and got back on the highway for home. This time, for some reason, I didn't feel sad when it came time to leave Michigan. I had started looking at my life differently because I was 16 years old. I thought that I could endure my last 2 years. When school started, I was sad that Saul wasn't there. In many ways, I was missing him, and I wondered what he was doing. I was always thinking about turning 18 and being on my own. I imagined my whole world changing. I took driver's education and felt pretty confident about it. Months went by, and one day, while I was in school, a classmate told me that Saul was visiting. I thought he had forgotten all about me. I got butterflies and panicked as he stopped me during my class break. We hugged, and then he asked me to go with him to an empty classroom. I told him that I had to go to my next class. Still, he said that he'd covered for me. Before I knew it, he had me pinned up in the back of a corner in the classroom One minute we were talking, and then he was kissing all over my lips. Time zoomed by pretty fast. Before I knew it, I skipped my fourth and fifth period classes. I knew then that I had to leave him, and we said our goodbyes. My conscience had been trying to tell me that it was too risky to skip 2 classes, but I wasn't paying it any mind. I felt stupid for getting suspended from school for a week. I told my grandparents the truth, that I had skipped class to talk to Saul. My grandfather wanted to know if we had had sex, and I said to him that we had only talked. I only prayed my father wouldn't find out, although my suspension was all the talk through the family in Michigan and California. I avoided seeing him. It felt like my whole world had ended. It was the longest week of my life. Plus, I couldn't talk to Saul to tell him that he had lied to me about covering me for skipping class, and he couldn't call me because I had never given him my number. When I returned to school, the students stared at me because the rumor had spread all over. I heard that Saul had gone back to Chicago, and I was relieved because he had put so much pressure on me. But he started secretly sending me love letters, pictures, cards, and money. I couldn't wait to open the mailbox and see a letter addressed from him. It would make my whole week. I didn't know what to say back to him, but when I wrote to give him my number, the words just came. Eventually, these letters started to take effect. My heart started feeling things that I had never felt before. I couldn't keep my mind off Saul. The more I thought of him, the deeper my feelings grew. My unhappiness at home seemed to subside because there was something else going on inside my little heart. As time went on, I never thought about where this fairy tale was heading. Saul had plenty of opportunities where he was living to date and find another woman to settle down with, but he kept calling even though I couldn't go on a date with him. As spring of 1983 rolled around, Saul called to invite me to his family reunion during the 4th of July. I wanted to go badly because I felt that I loved him. I rehearsed how I would ask for permission. I was very excited, but also afraid that my father would object. The day finally came when I got up the nerve to ask my grandmother. She asked me a lot of questions, but Saul had it all planned out. He invited my grandmother to come with us as a chaperone. Saul came to pick us up, and my grandmother decided to bring Uncle Amos. After we got to the reunion, I started feeling all special and grown. I met the whole family and learned that Saul was the baby of 14 children, though some were deceased. There were 60 grandchildren and counting. It was cool to see people I'd gone to school with, and they were shocked to see me. Saul persuaded me to ride to town, but I wasn't sure if that was being smart. He asked different people to cover for him by keeping my grandmother and uncle occupied. When we made it to town, he made sure that anybody and everybody saw us together. He wanted to make a statement that I was his girlfriend to feed his ego. After we got back from town, the look on my grandmother's face said trouble. She felt that there was going to be real trouble on her end if I was pregnant. I promised her that I had not had sex with Saul. He did try to go there, but I said that I was on my flower. It was the truth. I was too scared to have sex. I had this burst of energy when school started. I was finally a senior, and my time was coming. I was eager to do my chores and whatever my grandparents wanted. I could see that my life was about to change in a matter of months. I enjoyed being a senior because I received a lot of attention. Saul promised to give me money if I made good grades, so I got on the ball for the first time in my life. It was the best report card that I had ever gotten in all my 12 years of schooling. Saul gave me $5 for every B, and the money increased for every A. I applied myself and got focused on school. I prayed and kept a journal of my letters to Jesus. I listened and paid attention to everything that I came in contact with. I wore makeup often and jazzed up my clothes. I didn't let anything get me down to the point that I couldn't deal with it. I allowed things to roll off my shoulders like they never happened. My classmates were talking about going away to different colleges and universities. I never had any educational goals. I only wanted to get away from my father. I realized later on in my life that I wasn't able to live to be who I wanted to be because of him. I was forced to become this frightened little girl who struggled for acceptance, love, and protection. I couldn't enjoy my youth like my peers. I was too busy trying to protect my spirit, body, and soul from the evils that wanted to destroy me. I prayed to King Jesus, thanking him for protecting me to live to see some accomplishments that I thought I'd never see. During the week of my 18th birthday, I received a package from my mother. Inside the box, there was a birthday card, some money, and my birth certificate. Jonathan's name was on my birth certificate as my father. I felt confused about why my mother lied to me years ago by saying that another man was my father. I wanted to ask her about it, but I was too afraid to upset her. She had an unruly temper and a streak of violence. I concluded that it was meaningless to confront her because both of my parents were mentally and emotionally unhealthy. Finally, graduation was approaching and my classmates were planning the prom. I still had issues with my father controlling my participation in my senior outings. He expected me to ask him for permission first. I didn't want to go to prom because I didn't have anything nice to wear, plus Saul wasn't home. During this time, I finally opened up to Miss King, my home economics teacher, about my father's abuse. She started crying. She had taught us about these matters during the years she was my teacher, so I don't know what made me confess it at this stage. She offered to help me and wanted to know my plans after graduation. I told her that I was leaving as soon as I graduated and assured her that I would be all right. I knew that I would do the two things required, graduating from high school and turning 18. On graduation night, my classmates arranged a party in Selma. My father didn't want me to go. I was standing outside his car in the school parking lot, debating and negotiating. One of my closest classmates interrupted us to ask me, "What am I going to do?" I agreed to leave with her. Rocky was in town for a few weeks to help Jonathan out with some construction and upkeep on the property. Whenever Rocky's life was bad, he would show up and disappear when things cooled down. When I returned home after the party, I could hear Jonathan talking about me to Rocky. I felt that I had a choice for the first time in my life, and I'm still glad that I took that stand. At this point, my grandmother didn't care anymore about what I did. She wanted me to be on my own because she was tired of watching over me. She felt that she had given me all she could and that it was a burden to protect me. I had my things packed days before graduation. My grandfather's cousin that lived in Birmingham, who came down to visit other kinfolks and attend church on Sundays, agreed to take me to Birmingham to catch the Greyhound bus. I had no idea how much my bus fare would cost, but all I needed was a one-way ticket going to Detroit. I was blessed to have enough money from graduation gifts. Miss King blessed me by giving me some extra money for food on my journey. During this particular time, my father had left to take his girlfriend, Miss Patty, to Florida. I knew that if I didn't make my move while he was away, it would be terrifying to escape once he returned. He wanted me to stay in Alabama and attend a local junior college and offering me to drive his car. However, I was not listening to anything that he had to say that would delay me any longer. When Cousin Finest arrived to pick me up, I couldn't believe that the day had finally come. I put my bags in the trunk of his car and gave my grandparents and Uncle Amos bear hugs. I expressed that I was thankful and I felt that they were glad for me, but I detected sadness too. They told me to be careful and remember the stories they taught me about calling on the name of Jesus. As we drove away from Wakefield Hill, I looked up at the bank and stared at the red dirt. I thought that I was leaving for good. Perry County was where I learned about having faith in Jesus. I spent many days in the fields farming, driving my granddaddy to church, singing those Southern spiritual hymns, learning valuable morals, and praying to Jesus. He protected me from all of the hurt and harm that came my way. I'll always remember my roots, the struggles, and all the pain. Thoughts were bouncing all around inside my head as Cousin Finest put me on the bus. I sat in the front, and while the bus drove off, I waved at him.